North of town, the Merrick ranch looked much the same as it always had. The house still stood above the road, the barns filled before sunrise. Hands crossed the yard with feed buckets and coils of rope, and cattle still spread across pastures Jonas Merrick had spent most of his life building into something worth passing down. But after Elias left, the things that were harder to see began to change. Jonas stopped saying his eldest son's name. Eleanor did not force him to. Peter still rode out some Thursday afternoons. Jonas knew where his son was going, but he never asked. The work did not stop because a family was angry with itself. Books still had to balance. Wages had to be paid. Feed had to be bought before prices climbed. Cattle had to be sold at the right time. Buyers had to be dealt with, and every loan from the bank had a date attached to it, whether Jonas liked that date or not. Jonas had always made the final decisions, but for years, Elias had handled much of what came before them. He knew which buyers would push too hard on price, which hands were worth keeping through a slow season, when holding cattle another month might earn more, and when another month would only mean more feed going out than money coming in. Now the chair across from Jonas's desk was usually empty. Peter tried to help. He was never a man who watched someone struggle and walked away. If a fence needed fixing, Peter would work beside the hands until it was done. If cattle had to be moved, he could stay in the saddle all day without complaint. But running a ranch was different. Peter liked town better than ledgers. He liked an evening with friends better than sitting over feed costs for the coming winter. And until Elias left, Peter had never believed he would need to learn the things his brother already knew. So Jonas took more of the work back onto himself. He checked the books, he met the buyers, he argued with suppliers, he went over payroll at night and contracts before breakfast. Then some of the business Jonas had expected through Beatrice's family began to disappear. Nothing happened loudly. One buyer simply went somewhere else. A credit arrangement became less generous. The bank asked for more careful records before extending terms it once would have approved with little discussion. None of it was enough to bring down a ranch the size of Merrick. But each change gave Jonas one more thing to carry. Eleanor saw him coming to supper later. She saw the lamp under his office door long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. More than once, she saw him stop after standing too quickly, one hand pressed against his chest until whatever troubled him passed. "You need to rest," she told him. Jonas shook his head. "I can't rest yet." Peter saw it too. He began spending fewer evenings in town. He stayed closer to home. He tried harder. But a year spent avoiding the parts of ranching he found dull could not be made up in a few weeks. One evening, Jonas sat behind the open ledger while Peter stood across from him, trying to explain an expense he did not fully understand himself. Jonas looked from the figures to his son. "You approved this?" Peter hesitated. "I thought the price was fair." "You thought?" "Father." Jonas started to answer, then his face darkened. His hand closed hard around the edge of the desk. Peter moved around the table just as Jonas bent forward, struggling to draw a full breath. Eleanor came through the doorway and stopped. "Jonas?" He tried to wave them off. This time, he could not. 4 days later, Jonas Merrick still had not left his bed. Eleanor stood in the hall with Peter and looked toward the closed bedroom door. Then she said quietly, "Go get your brother." Peter rode hard enough that his horse was sweating when he reached Elias's ranch. Elias came out from the barn before Peter had fully dismounted. "Father's sick." Elias stopped. "How bad?" "He hasn't been out of bed in 4 days. "Mother?" "With him. She sent me." Peter looked at his brother. "We need you home." Elias looked at Mabel. She didn't ask what he wanted to do. She asked, "How soon can we leave?" He didn't have to answer with words. He was already moving toward the barn before Peter had finished catching his breath. There was too much on the place to leave to chance. Elias rode to the Hargrove place before noon and came back with a nod instead of an argument. Tom Hargrove had minded stock before and said he'd bring his boy to sleep in the loft until they were back. Mabel wrote it out at the kitchen table, what needed doing and when, how much of the reserved grain Tom was and wasn't to touch. She left the ledger open to the last page, ink still drying, so there'd be no guessing at what the place owed or was owed. By the time the wagon was loaded, the sun had already tipped past noon. Peter rode ahead. Elias and Mabel followed at a pace the horses could hold for the distance. Neither spoke for the first few miles. Mabel didn't ask if he was afraid of what he'd find. She only asked, "Do you know what you're going to say to him?" "No." "Then don't decide before you get there." He didn't answer that either, but his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the tension going out of them for the first time since Peter had ridden into the yard. The Merrick ranch came into sight before dusk, the house lit against the hillside the way it had been the day Mabel first saw it, though nothing else about arriving there felt the same. Eleanor was on the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. She went to Elias first and held on to him longer than she ever had, long enough that he had to be the one to loosen his arms first. When she turned to Mabel, there was none of the careful distance from that first visit. She took both of Mabel's hands in hers. "Thank you for coming." Peter was already at Elias's elbow. "I'll show you where things stand." He said it fast, the way a man talks when he's been carrying something alone too long and is relieved to hand off part of the weight. Elias went with him toward the barns, without going inside first. Mabel went in with Eleanor. The house was quieter than she remembered, quieter than a house with this many rooms should be. Eleanor led her partway down the hall and stopped outside a closed door. "He's been asking after the ranch since he woke this morning, not after himself." A short breath. "That's how I knew he wasn't as poorly as the doctor said." Elias came in from the yard not long after, boots still carrying dust from the barn. He didn't stop to change before he went to his father's door. Jonas was propped against the pillows, thinner through the face than Elias had ever seen him, his hands still and folded on the blanket instead of working at something the way they always used to be. "Your mother sent for you." "I know." "I didn't." "I know that too." Neither said anything else for a moment. Jonas's eyes moved over him slowly, the road dust still on his coat, the tired set of his jaw, before he spoke again. "What did the doctor say?" Something in Jonas's jaw tightened, a son walking in and going straight to the problem, the way he'd once have gone straight to a buyer's price instead of asking how the drive north had gone. "I'm not here to argue with you." Elias pulled the one chair in the room closer to the bed and sat. "Not today." Jonas studied him a moment longer, then let the question go without pressing it further, the closest thing to agreement either of them had left in them. Elias found the ledger where he expected it, on the desk that had once been his. Peter set it in front of him and stepped back, quick to give it up. "You're here now." Peter's hand hovered near the cover a moment longer than it needed to. "You'll make more sense of it." Elias didn't open it. He slid it back across the desk. "Sit down. You're going through it with me." "Elias!" "I'm not staying forever. You need to know this." Peter pulled up the second chair. It took the better part of an hour to see the shape of it. Nothing in the book said Peter had run the place into the ground. The herd was fed, the hands were paid, the fences that mattered were standing. But Jonas had been carrying too much of it alone, and it showed in a dozen small places. 2 invoices paid later than they should have been. The feed reserve thinner than Elias would have let it get. A note from the bank asking for records every month instead of every season. A few buyers who'd once taken Jonas's word on a handshake now wanted terms in writing first. None of it alone would sink the ranch. Together, it was a man doing the work of 2 and slowly losing ground on both. "How long has it been like this?" Peter didn't answer right away. "Since the wedding. Worse, since the Prescotts pulled out." Elias went back through the columns a second time, slower, the way he used to when a number didn't sit right with him. Peter watched him do it instead of looking away, and asked when he didn't understand something instead of nodding along. "This one." Elias tapped a line near the bottom of a page. "Why is it marked twice?" Peter leaned in. "I don't know." "Find out. Don't guess at it. Ask the supplier directly and bring me what he says." Peter didn't argue that it was beneath him or that a hand could be sent instead. He wrote the name down and folded the paper into his shirt pocket. careful with it, like something he didn't intend to forget. Down the hall, Mabel had not gone near a ledger. She'd found Eleanor in the kitchen before supper and simply started working alongside her, kneading, stirring, carrying water, the way she'd learned to fit herself into any kitchen that needed an extra pair of hands, without asking first whether she was wanted there. Eleanor let her stay without comment, which was its own kind of answer. It was only after the house had gone quiet that night that Mabel sat down across from Elias with the ledger between them. He walked her through how Merrick land kept its accounts, different from the small columns she and Elias kept at home, heavier, older, built for a place with more moving parts. She followed it easily enough, and within the hour had found 2 entries that didn't reconcile. A payment recorded twice under different hands, a delivery marked paid that the receipt said wasn't. Small things. The kind of thing a tired man doing another man's job misses without meaning to. Elias watched her mark the corrections in a hand steadier than his own had been at that hour and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Peter found them still at it when he came through with a lamp for the hall. He stopped in the doorway a moment, looking at the 2 of them bent over the same page, before he went on without saying what he'd noticed. The next evening, Mabel made chicken and dumplings, soft enough for a man who'd barely managed broth the week before, seasoned the way she'd learned to season for someone with no appetite left to spare. Eleanor carried the tray up herself. Jonas ate more of it than he had of anything since the fever broke, and ate it steadily, without the pauses that had marked every other meal that week. "Mabel made it," Eleanor said, pleased enough to say it plainly. Jonas's spoon stopped over the bowl. "I see." He didn't lift it again. Eleanor watched him a moment. "You liked it 30 seconds ago. I'm not hungry anymore." Eleanor didn't argue with him. She only took the tray back down herself and didn't tell Mabel what he'd said, only that he'd eaten well, which was true enough not to be a lie. By the 4th day, Jonas could sit up against the pillows on his own and hold a full conversation without losing his breath partway through it. The color had come back some, though not all the way, and the doctor allowed that another week of rest might see him out of bed for short stretches. Eleanor did not share in the improvement. She had slept little since the night Jonas's hand closed on the desk edge, up before dawn to check on him, awake past midnight listening for a change in his breathing, and in between carrying the ordinary weight of a house that didn't stop needing tending just because its head was laid up. She worried over Peter, whether he was learning fast enough, whether the ranch would hold. She worried, without saying so to anyone, whether Elias being home again would end in another door slammed the way the last one had. None of it showed until the morning it did. The signs had been there for days, if anyone had been looking for them, instead of at Jonas. She'd stopped finishing her own supper, claiming she wasn't hungry after tending his. She'd taken to sitting rather than standing while she shelled beans or mended, then catching herself at it and standing back up before anyone noticed. Twice, Mabel had seen her hand go still on a task mid-motion, as if she'd forgotten for a moment what she was doing and why. Mabel found her on the kitchen floor the following morning, one hand still braced against the counter where she'd caught herself on the way down, her face nearly as pale as the flour sack beside her. "Eleanor, I'm all right." She wasn't. Mabel had her by the arm and into a chair before she finished saying it. The doctor, sent for again within the hour, found nothing that alarmed him. Exhaustion, plainly. Too little sleep, too little food eaten sitting down instead of standing at a stove. Too many weeks of carrying more than one body was built to carry alone. Rest, he said. Real food. A few days of someone else doing the carrying, and she'd be back on her feet with no lasting harm done. Jonas heard the whole of it second-hand from his bed, unable to get to her himself. He said nothing when Eleanor was carried past his open door to her own room down the hall. But later, when Mabel brought his tray, he asked after her twice in the space of a few minutes, and didn't touch his food until she'd answered both times. That someone else was Mabel. She cooked for the house now, not just for Jonas. She carried Eleanor's meals up along with his, and sat with her long enough to see that she ate them, rather than pushed them around the plate. She managed the wash, the mending, The small, unglamorous work of keeping a house running that no one thought about until it stopped happening. And most nights, once the rest of it was done, she still sat down across from Elias with the ledger, because the ranch hadn't stopped needing that either. Elias watched her go longer each day without complaint, and liked it less each time he watched it. "I'm getting someone in here to help," he told her one evening, before she'd even set the ledger down. "For what?" "For everything you're doing." Mabel didn't look up right away. "Your mother needs a few days, not a new household staff." "Mabel, if I can't manage it, I'll tell you." He studied her a moment, the way he did when he wanted to press further and knew pressing wouldn't move her. She wasn't proving anything to him or to the house. She simply believed, plainly and without drama, that this was a stretch of days to get through and not a life she was signing herself into. And something in the certainty of that kept him from arguing it further. He let it go. But he watched her more closely after that, quick to notice when her steps slowed or her voice went thin toward evening. The first time, Mabel carried the tray in herself because Eleanor was already asleep by then, worn past the hour she usually managed to stay upright. Jonas looked past her toward the door. "Where's Eleanor?" "Sleeping." "In the middle of the day?" Mabel set the tray down without hurrying. "Because the doctor told her to." Jonas didn't answer that. He looked at the tray instead, and something in his face settled. Not soft exactly, but quieter than it had been. He understood well enough what had put his wife in that bed, and it wasn't a fever. The second time, he complained before she'd even set the cup down. "That coffee's weak enough to see through." The doctor said less coffee. "The doctor isn't the one drinking it." "No." Mabel poured it anyway, only half a cup. "You are. That's why I listened to him." Jonas looked at her the way he might look at a hand who'd talked back and turned out to be right. He didn't argue further. He drank what she gave him and didn't ask for more. The third time, he noticed the ink on her fingers before he noticed the tray. "What are you doing with the ranch books?" "Helping Elias." "He managed them before you were here." "With you?" Mabel didn't look up from setting the cup down. A beat passed before she added, "You're in bed now." It wasn't a challenge. She said it the way she'd have said the weather had turned, a fact laid flat on the table with nothing behind it but truth. Jonas didn't have an answer ready for that, which was its own kind of answer. He'd expected, without quite admitting he'd expected it, that she'd come into this house and take up space that wasn't hers. His ledgers, his son's attention, the running of a place she had no history with. Instead, she'd folded herself into whatever gap needed filling and asked for nothing in return, not even his approval, which was the one thing he'd assumed she'd want most. He was quiet long enough that Mabel had nearly finished clearing the tray before he spoke again. "Elias tell you how this ranch was built?" "Some of it." "Not all of it, I'd guess." He shifted against the pillows, the closest thing to settling in for a conversation he'd managed all week. "There's a difference between a ranch a man's given and a ranch he built himself, brick by brick, debt by debt. Elias was given his start here. What he's got now, out on his own land, that one he built. I doubt he's told you which one he's prouder of." Mabel considered that. He doesn't talk about pride much. He talks about what still needs fixing. Something crossed Jonas's face. Recognition, maybe, of a habit he knew from the inside. He watched her straighten the blanket at the foot of the bed before she left. An unnecessary tidiness. The kind of small correction a person makes out of habit rather than need. "Mabel." She stopped at the door. "The dumplings." He didn't look at her when he said it. They were good. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the first thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived that hadn't been a complaint or a question. And Mabel understood it for what it was. A man laying down the smallest possible weight, testing whether the ground beneath him would hold if he let go of any more. "I'll tell the kitchen," she said, and left him to whatever he wanted to make of that. Mabel brought the tray in and set it down, and Eleanor studied her instead of the food. The thin set of her shoulders, the shadows under her eyes, the tired line of a mouth that hadn't complained once. "Sit down," Eleanor said, "before you become the second person in this house the doctor orders into bed." Mabel managed a small smile, but she sat. Eleanor's room shared a wall with Jonas's, close enough that little passed between it and the hallway without her hearing some part of it. "I hear more than I let on," she said. "More of what he says to you than you'd probably like me to know." Mabel didn't answer that with a complaint. She only waited. "Don't hate him for it." She said it plainly, the way a woman lays out a fact she's had a long time to settle with. "Jonas and I married when he had almost nothing to his name. This ranch, every board of that barn, every acre of that pasture, he built it himself, out of debt and stubbornness and years neither of us talk about much anymore. There were seasons we counted every dollar twice before it left the house." She looked toward the window. "But he counted every dollar the ranch spent. He never once counted them against me. I was never left wanting for food or a coat in 30 years, even in the leanest of them." She turned her hands over in her lap. "He's harder on the men who work for him than most ranchers in this county, but I've never known him to treat one badly. A man who does honest work gets paid honest wages, every week, whether the season's kind or not. When money's been tight, he's taken the extra work onto his own back before he'd let a hired man go if there was any way around it." Mabel listened without saying anything. "The trouble with Jonas," Eleanor went on, "is that the same things that made him good at building all this made him difficult to live alongside. Discipline turns to rigidity if a man doesn't watch it. Responsibility turns to control. He carried more weight than most men ever do, and somewhere along the way he decided that carrying it meant he was the one who got to say what was right for the rest of us." She was quiet a moment before she spoke again. "He expected more of Elias than he ever expected of Peter, or of our daughter. Not only because Elias was the eldest. Jonas knew exactly what it costs to keep a place like this standing. He'd carried that weight himself, every year of his life. He knew precisely what he was putting on Elias's shoulders, because it was the same weight he'd never set down." "And Beatrice?" Eleanor's mouth tightened, but she didn't look away. "Part of it was the ranch. I won't pretend otherwise." A pause. "But part of him truly believed he was making Elias's future easier. He's never been a man who can tell the difference between the two." Mabel didn't say Jonas had been right. She understood him better now than she had that morning, and that was as far as understanding could carry her. Eleanor reached over and rested a hand briefly on Mabel's. "Wanting good for someone," she said, "doesn't mean you get to choose their life for them." The day settled into a rhythm neither brother spoke about directly. Elias didn't take the work back from Peter. He stood beside him while Peter did it. Together they walked the warehouse and counted what feed remained, sack by sack, instead of trusting the number already written down. They rode out to the supplier Peter had been avoiding and stood through the conversation together, Peter doing the talking, while Elias said nothing unless asked. They sat over payroll at the desk until every wage matched every hour, and worked out, on paper, how many head the reserve could carry if the winter ran long. Elias made him show his work. 22 head through to spring, Peter said one afternoon, sliding the figure across the desk. "How did you get there?" Peter walked him through it, feed on hand, feed still owed from the mill, a rough guess at how far the pasture would carry them into the cold. Again, "You know the answer." "I do." Elias didn't move to take the pencil from him. "You need to." Peter went through it a second time, slower, and found on his own where the first number had come up short. It wasn't all correction. Late one evening, going back through a decision Peter had made about a hauling contract while Elias was still settling in at his father's bedside, Elias set the ledger down and looked at him. That was the right call. Peter blinked. You don't have to sound surprised. I wasn't. You were. Elias almost smiled at that, the closest either of them had come to easy since Elias had ridden back through the gate. He didn't argue the point further. He only pushed the ledger back across the desk and nodded once toward the next column waiting to be checked. Word reached Agnes within the week, both her parents down at once, one confined to bed and the other not far behind him, and she arrived within a day of hearing it, her own household left in her husband's hands for as long as it took. She made herself useful without being asked. She sat with Eleanor through the long stretches of the afternoon when the house went quiet. She took over the kitchen for 2 full days, freeing Mabel to do nothing but rest and see to Jonas. She fell into the rhythm of the house the way someone does who grew up inside it, without needing anyone to show her where things belonged. It was on the second evening that she found Mabel alone on the back step and sat down beside her instead of going in. She studied Mabel a moment, the same careful look Eleanor had given her days before. "I wish I could stay longer," Agnes said finally. "Truly." She looked toward the barn, where lamplight showed under the door. "But things at home are bad enough right now that I can't leave Hale carrying it alone. Our own place is short-handed this season, and there's only so much he can carry by himself. I can't leave him with all of it." Mabel understood before Agnes finished saying it. A family only had so many hands to spread across 2 troubles at once. "I hate asking this when you're already doing too much," Agnes went on. "But if I can't get back for a few days, will you keep an eye on Mother for me?" "Both of them," Mabel said. Agnes looked at her a moment, then laughed, short and real, the first easy sound either of them had made in days. "Both of them," she agreed. She was quiet a moment after that, watching the barn light flicker where Elias and Peter were still working through the evening's figures. "I'm glad Elias didn't come back alone," she said. She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. She got up, brushed off her skirt, and went back inside to check on her mother before the house settled for the night, leaving Mabel on the step with the words to sit with a while longer. Eleanor was back on her feet within the week, moving slower than before, but moving. The house settled, once she did. It was around then that Mabel began noticing something in Peter she hadn't seen since they'd arrived. He was up before sunrise now, out at the barns before anyone called him. He stopped finding reasons to ride into town. There had always been a reason before, an errand that could have waited, a friend he suddenly needed to see. Those reasons dried up without anyone remarking on it. He took to standing near Mabel's shoulder in the evenings while she worked the ledger, watching rather than wandering off, and began asking real questions instead of nodding along the way he used to. "How do you know that number's wrong?" he asked one night, leaning over the page. Mabel pointed to 2 lines a column apart. "This invoice was paid here, and here it's paid again, under a different hand's writing."
She let him look a moment longer before she said the rest.
"Don't just look at one line. Follow where the money came from and where it went. If it doesn't end up somewhere it should, it's wrong, even if the line itself looks fine."
Peter took that in the way he'd started taking most things in lately, quietly, and like he meant to keep it. That night, once the ledger was closed, Elias and Mabel went out to sit on the porch, the air cool enough now to feel like the season was finally turning.
"Your brother asked me about the books today," Mabel said. "I know. You don't seem surprised." Elias almost smiled. "There's a girl in town." Mabel raised an eyebrow at him, and he told her the rest, that Peter had been fond of her for months, and that she'd told him plainly she wasn't interested in building a life with a man who spent more time finding reasons to leave home than reasons to stay in it. "Seems only love could change his habits," Elias said. "That's one thing you brothers have in common." "I was never that bad." "Of course not." He knew she was teasing him and let himself be teased. And for a moment, they were just 2 people laughing quietly on a porch, instead of 2 people holding up half a household each. Then something in him settled, and he looked at her the way he did when he meant to say something he'd been putting off. "Thank you." "For what?" "My mother, my father, This house? He shook his head slightly, like the list still surprised him. And then you sit with me over those books every night besides, when you've already given the day everything you had. You don't have to thank me. I do. He took her hand and held it between both of his, turning it over gently, tracing a thumb across a callus that hadn't been there a year ago. If this gets to be too much, tell me. I'm all right. I mean it. If you're too tired, or Father says something he has no right to say to you, we're leaving. I'll take you home myself. I'll ride back here every morning, do what needs doing, and come back to you every night. Mabel considered that. And who stays with your mother and father while you're riding back and forth? Mother's better. Better isn't the same as well, and your father still can't manage a full day alone. Mabel, I want to stay. She said it plainly, without any weight behind it beyond the truth of it, and he looked at her a long moment before he pulled her in against him, her head fitting under his chin the way it had 100 evenings before this one. All right, he said, quiet into her hair. I'll listen to you. Neither of them said anything else. The porch held them a while longer, the lamp inside throwing a thin line of light across the boards, and the house behind them, for once, entirely quiet. Jonas came down to the table for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, moving slower than he used to, but under his own power. And for a while, the meal felt like any other family had a right to. Peter reported, without being asked, that the supplier dispute over the doubled invoice had been settled in their favor. The man had made the error himself and cut the amount owed rather than argue it. Jonas nodded at that, something close to pride in it, and said the boy had handled it well. He wouldn't have caught it on his own a month ago, Elias said. I might have, Peter said. Eventually. Eventually isn't the same as in time to matter. Peter didn't take offense at it. He only shrugged, half a smile on him, and reached for more of the potatoes. Mabel refilled cups without being asked to. Agnes had gone home 3 days before, back to her own place and her own husband, promising to return the moment she was needed. The table was smaller for her absence, but it was an easy kind of quiet. For a little while, it was only a family eating supper together. Then Jonas turned to Elias. How's the bank sitting on the feed loan? Settled through spring. I told them we'd hold 22 head through winter instead of 30. Jonas set down his fork. 30 was the number I gave them. 30 was the number before anyone counted the reserve properly. Elias kept his voice even. 22 is what the feed will actually carry without buying more at a loss. I've carried 30 through worse winters than this one. You carried 30 when you had money behind you the ranch doesn't have this year. Jonas's jaw tightened. You've had a year away, and now you think you know better than the man who built this place? No. Elias didn't look away from him. I think I know what it costs to build one now. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something old has surfaced under something new. Jonas's voice dropped, but it didn't soften. You left me to carry this. You sent me away. Nobody moved to stop it. Mabel set her cup down carefully, the way a person moves when the ground under a room is started to shift. This isn't helping anyone, she said, quiet, aimed at both of them. Jonas turned to her instead. You grew up without a family to answer to. His voice was flat, the words out before the weight of them had caught up to him. Don't tell me what it takes to hold one together. The room went still. Mabel didn't cry. She didn't move at all for a moment, the way a person goes still after a blow that hasn't finished landing yet. Father, enough. Elias was on his feet. Jonas kept going past the point where he should have stopped. She came into this family and— No, Jonas. Eleanor was standing. He looked at her, thrown by it, in a way he hadn't been thrown by his own son. What? You don't get to use what she lost as a reason to make her smaller. Nobody at the table spoke. Eleanor's hands were steady on the back of her chair, but her voice carried further than it needed to in a room that quiet. She cooked for you when you wouldn't even thank her for it. She cared for me when I couldn't stand up long enough to care for myself. She helped Elias with those books after this whole house had gone to sleep, night after night, and she stayed here, in this house, while you gave her every reason in the world to leave. She turned toward Jonas fully now. You kept us fed. You kept a roof over us. You built this ranch out of nothing, and no one at this table denies you that. A beat. But somewhere along the way, you decided that because you carried the most weight, you were the only one allowed to decide how the rest of us lived. Everything I did was for this family. A great deal of it was. Eleanor didn't back down from that. Some of it was also your pride. Jonas opened his mouth and closed it again. Do you know, Eleanor said, quieter now, how many times you thought I agreed with you simply because I'd stopped arguing? He said nothing. You wanted Elias's burden to be lighter. Instead, you tried to choose his life for him. The room held its silence a moment longer. Jonas looked at his wife as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time in a long while and didn't like everything he saw. He didn't answer her. He pushed back his chair, slower than he needed to, and left the table without another word. The sound of his boots on the stairs, the only thing moving in the whole quiet house. Nobody spoke for a moment after he'd gone. Peter looked at his plate, then at the door, unsure which silence was safest. Elias came around the table and crouched by her chair, his hand finding hers under the cloth. Are you all right? I'm all right, Mabel said, and this time it was closer to true than the last time she'd said it. Eleanor sat back down slowly, the fight going out of her posture, though not out of her face, and looked at the empty chair across the table for a long moment. Jonas sat in the dark of his room for a long while before he lit the lamp, and even then didn't do much with the light beyond letting it sit there. He thought of Elias, small, no more than 7, running into the yard, shouting that he'd ridden the young gelding alone for the first time, no hand on the lead, his face split wide with the kind of pride a boy only has once or twice in a childhood. Jonas remembered the pull in his own chest, sharp and real. What he'd said instead was, "Next time, keep your back straighter." The boy's face had fallen a little before he caught himself and nodded, already trying to fix what hadn't been wrong. He thought of Eleanor after Peter was born, worn through with exhaustion and smiling anyway, the baby against her chest. He'd wanted to tell her something then. He couldn't now recall exactly what. And what had come out instead was a question aimed at the doctor. The boy's healthy? He'd never gone back and said the other thing. He thought of his daughter's wedding day, Eleanor quietly grieving the house going a little emptier, and Jonas standing beside her, wanting to offer some comfort he didn't have words for. She has her own home now, he'd said, which was true, and which had done nothing at all for the grief in his wife's face. A whole life measured out that way. Work, wages, land held on to through years that should have taken it from him. A family fed, clothed, kept standing through every hard winter he could remember. He had always believed that was enough, that a man who did all of that had done what a man was meant to do, and the rest could be assumed. Eleanor's voice came back to him now, quieter than it had been at the table. You thought I agreed with you because I stopped arguing. And Mabel, the girl he'd told, in front of his whole family, that she didn't understand what it took to hold one together. The same girl who was under this roof right now, tending his wife and his books and his own stubborn pride because she hadn't wanted his son to lose his parents the way she'd lost her own. For the first time and longer than he could measure, Jonas let the question sit instead of arguing it down. Maybe he had been wrong. He already knew the answer was yes. Jonas didn't come down the next morning. Eleanor carried the breakfast tray up herself, same as she had every morning since the fever, and set it on the table beside the bed. He looked at it without touching it. I'd rather have those chicken and dumplings. Eleanor didn't need to ask which ones. Mabel's? I know who made them. She didn't tease him for it, not this time. She only nodded, took the tray back down with her, and went to find Mabel in the kitchen. Your father-in-law wants chicken and dumplings. Mabel looked up, surprised enough that it showed for a moment before she covered it. She didn't make a show of it, just wiped her hands and set to the pot, the same way she'd have started supper for anyone in the house. When it was ready, she filled a bowl and held it out to Eleanor. Eleanor didn't take it. You take it up to him. He asked you. He asked for your cooking. Eleanor's eyes stayed steady on her. I know my husband. He has something he wants to say to you, and it isn't going to come out easier with me standing in the doorway. Mabel carried the bowl up herself. Jonas was sitting up when she came in, more upright than he'd managed in days. She set the tray down without a word and turned to go. Mabel? She stopped. He didn't look at her right away. When he finally did, the words came slower than she'd ever heard him speak. What I said last night was cruel. A beat. And it wasn't true. Another, longer, I'm sorry. Mabel didn't tell him it was all right, because it hadn't been, and she wasn't going to make it smaller than it was just to ease the room. She only said, "Thank you for saying it," and meant it as far as it went. Jonas nodded once, like a man setting a weight down carefully rather than dropping it. Mabel. She paused again at the door. Ask Eleanor to come in, please. Eleanor came in a moment later, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked between them with the particular wariness of a woman who'd heard raised voices in this house too many times lately. Send word to our daughter, Jonas said. Why? I want everyone here. Jonas, I have something I need to say. He looked at his wife, steady now in a way he hadn't been in weeks. And I want to say it while I still know how. Agnes came back within the day, her husband spared for the evening by a neighbor who owed him a favor. She found the house different from the one she'd left 3 days before, quieter in a way that felt like relief rather than dread. Jonas came down to the table himself this time, slower than before, but steady on his feet, and took his seat at the head of it the way he always had. The meal started warm and stayed that way. Peter telling a story about a hand who'd nearly walked a bull into the wrong pen. Eleanor laughing in a way none of them had heard from her in weeks. Jonas didn't wait for the meal to end before he set down his fork. I have things to say to each of you. I'd rather say them now than lose the nerve for it later. Nobody argued that he ought to wait. The table went quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind that makes room for something rather than dreading it. He turned to Eleanor first. I mistook your silence for agreement more times than I can count. His voice didn't waver, but it came slower than his usual certainty. I don't know how long I've been doing that. Longer, I think, than either of us would like to say out loud. Eleanor didn't tell him it was forgiven, not yet. She only reached over and took his hand on the tablecloth and held it. He turned to Elias next. Elias set down his own fork, giving his father his full attention the way he hadn't in longer than either of them would admit. I used this ranch, this name, everything I meant to leave you one day. He held his son's eyes, something in his own gone unguarded in a way Elias had rarely seen. I used all of it to make obedience look like duty. You chose your wife over what I offered you, and I punished you for choosing her. Elias said nothing. He only waited, jaw tight, for whatever came next. You were right to choose her. The words landed heavier than anything Jonas had said all night, and Elias's hand found Mabel's under the table without either of them looking down to do it. Jonas turned to Peter. I let you believe there'd always be someone else to carry the hard part of this place. That your brother would do it, or I would, and you'd never have to. He shook his head slightly. That was as much my failure as it was yours. A man doesn't learn to carry weight if no one ever hands him any. Peter didn't argue it. I believed it too, he said, quiet, for a long time. Long enough that I stopped noticing I believed it. I know. Jonas looked at him steadily. You're carrying it now. That's what matters more than what came before.
He turned to Agnes.
I've asked less of your life than I should have these past years. Once you married and had a home of your own, I told myself that meant you didn't need looking after the way the rest of us did. I never asked what you were carrying over there. I should have. Agnes's eyes went bright, though she didn't let them spill over. I didn't need you to ask, Father, but I won't pretend it wouldn't have mattered if you had. Jonas nodded and didn't argue the point. Last, he turned to Mabel. The table went stiller than it had for anyone else. Even Peter set down his cup without a sound. I told you, in front of this whole family, that growing up without one meant you couldn't understand what it took to hold one together. He held her gaze, not flinching from it the way he might have a week ago. I was wrong. A beat, longer than the others. You understood exactly what this family was worth, at a time when I was too angry to see it myself. You cooked for a man who wouldn't thank you. You nursed my wife back onto her feet. You kept this family's books straight while the rest of us were too proud or too tired to manage it. No one in this house understands what it takes to hold a family together better than you do. Mabel's throat tightened, but she didn't let it climb any further than that. Beside her, Elias's hand tightened once around hers, brief, saying what he didn't need words for. "Thank you," she said, and it was enough. It didn't need to be more than that. Jonas looked around the table once, at all of them, not with pride exactly, but with something close to relief that, for now, it was holding together. "There's one more thing." Jonas waited until the plates had mostly cleared before he said it. "I want the lawyer out here this week. I mean to rewrite my will." The table objected before he'd finished the sentence. "You're getting better," Eleanor said. "You're not dying," Peter said, flatter, like the idea itself offended him. "I know." Jonas didn't argue either point. "That's exactly why I want to do it now, while I'm well enough to say clearly what I mean and not leave it for someone to guess at later." He looked around the table. "A month ago, I thought I had years yet before I needed to think about any of this. 4 days in that bed taught me not to count on years I haven't been given." Nobody argued further after that. He laid it out plain, no different from any plan he'd ever set down for the ranch. The house and a guaranteed income for Eleanor for as long as she lived, untouched by whatever else happened to the rest of it. The largest share to Elias, along with principal management once Jonas was no longer able to hold it himself. A smaller share to Peter. Something set aside for Agnes, income, not land, since her life and her husband's ran on a different place entirely. The rest to be worked out with the lawyer, line by line, the way any fair division ought to be. Elias was quiet through most of it. When Jonas finished, he spoke. "Then change mine." Jonas looked at him. "What?" "Give Peter the main ranch, the larger share, not just the running of it." Peter set down his glass. "Elias, leave me a smaller piece of the land and a smaller share of the income to go with it. That's enough." Jonas frowned, the number clearly not what he'd expected to hear pushed back at him. "You'd be giving up the greater part of what I meant to leave you." "I'm not giving anything up." Elias reached for Mabel's hand. "Mabel and I already have something of our own. We built it ourselves, out of nothing, and we mean to keep building it. This ranch was never going to be that place for us. Not anymore." "You were trained for this," Jonas said. "Years of it." "I was." Elias didn't look away from his father. "And Peter's learning it now. He can run this place. Not alone tomorrow, but he doesn't have to be alone tomorrow. I'll come when he needs me." He glanced at Peter, something steady passing between them. "That's not the same as living here again." "You'd rather build that place up from nothing," Jonas said, "than take what's already standing?" Elias looked at Mabel a moment before he answered. "Yes." Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Besides, you were right about one thing, Pa." Jonas waited. 2 ranches are stronger than one." For a moment, nobody at the table spoke. Jonas looked at his son, and something crossed his face as the words landed where they were meant to. The same line he'd once used to press Elias toward a marriage that would have joined 2 properties into one, now handed back to him, meaning something else entirely. 2 ranches, standing on their own, each holding up the other when it needed holding. Jonas's mouth eased into something close to a smile. "All right. A beat. Your choice." He said it the way he might once have closed a fair deal with a man he respected. No argument left in it, only agreement. The weight of the evening eased once the will was settled, and for a while it was only a family finishing supper together. Elias broke the quiet with something lighter. So, did she say yes? Peter nearly choked on his coffee. Elias! Who? Eleanor's head came up, sharp with interest. Agnes leaned forward at once. Yes? Who? Mabel already knew, and ducked her head to hide the smile she couldn't quite manage to swallow. Peter's been seeing a girl in town, Elias said, entirely unbothered by his brother's glare. Since before I came back, from the sound of it. I can tell them myself. You weren't going to. You've had weeks. Peter didn't deny that. Her name's Nora, he said, giving the table that much before he gave them the rest. Under the weight of everyone's attention, he admitted it, that Nora had told him plainly, months ago, that she wasn't interested in a man who couldn't be bothered to learn what it meant to be responsible for anything. That she wasn't going to build a life with someone who spent more time finding reasons to leave home than reasons to stay in it. Jonas looked at him steadily. Peter's face colored, but he didn't look away from it. She wasn't wrong. He let that sit a moment. She said yes. The table broke into something warmer than it had held all evening. Eleanor's hand went to her chest. Agnes laughed outright. I want to marry her, Peter said, plain, like he'd been waiting weeks for a table calm enough to say it to. Jonas didn't say much. He only asked, simply, You love her? Yes. She loves you? Yes. Jonas looked at his youngest son a long moment, weighing something that had nothing to do with ranches or ledgers. Then that's your decision to make, not mine. Peter hadn't expected it to be that easy, and it showed. But, Jonas added, and the room went quiet again in the good way. Once you make a family, Peter, you're responsible for that family. All of it, every season of it, not just the easy ones. Remember that. I will. Jonas nodded once, satisfied, and reached for his coffee, the same coffee Mabel had made too weak on purpose, and which he drank now without a single complaint, as if some part of him had finally stopped fighting the small corrections in his life, along with the large ones. In the days that followed the family table, Mabel found herself tired in a way rest didn't seem to touch. She put it down to the weeks behind her, the nursing, the ledgers, the nights that had run too long into morning, and said nothing of it to anyone. Since a person recovering from exhaustion was hardly worth remarking on in a house that had seen 2 people laid up already. It was Eleanor who noticed first. She found Mabel bent over the wash basin one morning, pale and still a moment after, and didn't ask if she was ill the way she might have a month ago. She only studied her, the particular quality of it, the way Mabel straightened after and went right back to her work as though nothing had happened. The color that came back to her face too quickly for it to be anything worn out and lingering. Eleanor had raised 3 children of her own. She knew the shape of that kind of mourning better than most doctors in the county. She said nothing to Mabel directly. She waited until supper, when the whole family was gathered, and set down her fork with a look on her face that made the table go quiet before she'd said a word. I believe, she said, we may have something else to celebrate before the year's out. It took Jonas a moment to understand her meaning, and when he did, something moved across his face that none of them had seen there in longer than they could remember. Open, unguarded, entirely without the careful reserve he kept over everything else. Truly? Eleanor looked at Mabel, who had gone pink and hadn't managed to say anything yet herself, and nodded. The table broke into noise, Peter's hand on Elias's shoulder. Agnes already reaching across to take Mabel's hand, Eleanor's eyes bright. Jonas recovered himself enough to speak. Then you'll stay here, he said, already deciding it, where there's a full house to look after you. Eleanor looked at him. Jonas stopped. Unless you'd rather not. I want to go home, Mabel said, gently but without hesitation. I can still manage the light work around the house, and Elias can look after me easier there than he could running back and forth from here. Jonas looked ready to argue it anyway. Eleanor put a hand on his arm, and he let the argument go, though not without a last look that made it plain the letting go cost him something. They didn't win the point, but they didn't let it go easily either. By the end of the week it was settled, a woman hired from town to help with the house until the child came, and 3 of the Merrick hands sent along with Elias and Mabel to see the ranch through whatever the season asked of it, whether Elias thought he needed them or not. "I didn't ask for them," Elias said, half amused, loading the wagon. "I know," Jonas said. "I'm not asking either." The morning they left, the wagon stood loaded before the sun was fully up, 3 of the Merrick hands already mounted and waiting at a respectful distance. "We've neglected our place long enough," Elias said, tightening the last strap on the wagon bed. Jonas didn't argue it, and didn't ask him to stay either. "Go." He looked past his son to the 3 hands. "Keep them as long as you need. A month, if the place calls for it. Send them back when you're caught up, and not before." "We could manage without them." "I didn't say you couldn't." Jonas's voice held the same flat certainty it always had, the words more instruction than favor. "Take them anyway." Elias let it go. There was no winning an argument with a man who decided to be generous and call it business. Peter came out to see them off, steadier on his feet in the yard than he'd been the day Elias arrived. "I'll send word if anything comes up I can't sort." "You'll sort more than you think," Elias said. "I know." Peter said it without the doubt that would have colored the words a month before. "But I'll still send word." Eleanor held Mabel a long moment at the wagon, her hand resting briefly, deliberately, over where the news still sat too new to show. She said nothing about it aloud, only let her hand rest there a beat longer than it needed to. Jonas came to the wagon last. He didn't embrace his son, not quite, but he gripped his hand and held it a moment longer than the handshakes they'd traded years ago across a desk. "Come back for the wedding," he said. "Whenever Peter finally sets a date." "We will." The wagon pulled out through the gate as the sun cleared the ridge, 3 hands falling in behind it, and Peter stood in the yard beside his parents, watching it go with something in his stance that hadn't been there a month before. The look of a man who no longer needed someone else's shadow to stand in. The months that followed settled into something steadier than either ranch had known in a long while. At Merrick, Peter kept the books himself now, without anyone standing over his shoulder to catch what he missed. He met buyers on his own and came away with terms his father would have approved of. He was up before the hands most mornings, and the trips into town, when he made them, had a purpose attached to them that hadn't always been there before. He still rode out to see Elias when a decision felt too large to carry alone. "What would you do?" he asked once, laying out a choice about whether to hold cattle another month or sell at the current price. "What do you think you should do?" Peter worked through it out loud, slower than Elias would have, and landed on an answer close enough to right that Elias didn't need to correct it. He only nodded and let his brother carry the rest of the decision home himself. On Elias and Mabel's own place, smaller and harder won than the one he'd grown up on, the herd grew by a modest, careful number, the kind Mabel's ledger could account for without strain. The fence held through every storm that tested it that season. Mabel kept the books, and no decision large enough to matter was made without the 2 of them talking it through first, just as it had always been between them. She was further along now than she'd let herself think about most days, the work slowing to match it without either of them making much of the change. 2 ranches, standing apart and holding steady, each one leaning on the other only when it needed to. The wedding was held in the yard at Merrick, under the kind of clear autumn sky that made a day feel like it had been chosen on purpose. Jonas stood near the front in his good coat, steadier on his feet than he'd been in a year, a small bundle held against his shoulder that he had not set down since breakfast. Eleanor had offered twice to take the baby, so he could shake hands properly with the arriving guests. Both times he'd shifted his grip without loosening it. "I've got him." "Jonas, you'll want your hands free for—" "I've got him." Eleanor let it go. She hadn't really expected to win that one anyway. Peter stood at the front looking nothing like the young man who used to find reasons to be anywhere but home. Nora walked up to meet him, the same woman who had once told him plainly he wasn't ready to build a life with anyone. Watching him now, steady, present, not glancing once toward the road, It was hard to argue she'd been wrong to wait for this version of him instead. Afterward, the whole yard turned into supper. Long tables, ranch hands mixing easily with town friends, a few faces from the children's home that Mabel still kept close. All of it loud and warm, in the way a gathering gets once the formal part is behind it. Elias stood near the edge of it, with Mabel beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. Across the yard, Jonas still hadn't handed off the baby. He stood watching Peter and Nora move through the crowd, accepting congratulations, laughing at something one of the hands said, and something settled and unguarded sat on Jonas's face while he watched it. Then his eyes moved, without hurry, to find Elias and Mabel. He didn't call anything across the yard. He didn't need to. He gave a small nod. Elias nodded back. Mabel's hand found Elias's, fingers threading through his without either of them looking down to do it. Jonas shifted the baby higher against his shoulder and turned his attention back to Peter and Nora. That's the end of Mabel and Elias's story. And I think it's one of the more complete endings we've told on this channel. But if I'm honest with you, what makes it feel complete isn't really the love between the two of them. It's what happened to the rest of the Merrick family along the way. Jonas finally saw his own stubbornness for what it was. Eleanor found the nerve to say the things she'd swallowed for 30 years. Peter stopped running from the parts of his life he used to avoid. Mabel and Elias, though, they never really changed, not the way the others did. From the first video to this one, they stayed exactly who they were: steady, certain, willing to build something on their own terms even when it cost them the easier path. If anything, it was the rest of the family that had to grow to meet them. And by the end, Mabel finally got to feel what the word family actually meant. Something she'd gone without for a very long time. That's what stuck with me most, writing this one. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through. I know it ran long, longer than most of what we put out here, and the fact that you're still with me at the end means more than you probably know. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We post a new Frontier story here every single day. See you in the next one.